under a mile of ice, something impossible happened. In July 2021, scientists published a discovery that challenged one of the most deeply established ideas in American archaeology. Not a spear point, not a burial site. Footprints, dozens of them, pressed into what was once soft lakebed mud in New Mexico, left behind by people walking, running, playing. Researchers dated the seeds trapped in the layers above and below those prints. And the numbers didn't just push the timeline back. Some came in at over 20,000 years old. That means people were already walking across North America, while most of the continent still lay buried under ice sheets, a mile thick. At a time when, according to nearly everything, archaeologists believed for the better part of a century, getting into the Americas should have been physically impossible. So, how did they get in? For decades, there was a tidy answer to that question. It was called the Clovis First Theory, named after a distinctive style of spear point discovered near Clovis, New Mexico, in the 1930s. The story went like this. As the last ice age began to loosen its grip, roughly 13,000 years ago, a narrow corridor opened between two massive ice sheets covering Canada. Hunters walked south through that gap, chasing mammoths into an empty, untouched continent. Clean, logical, taught as settled fact for generations. Then, the ground started contradicting the textbooks. Picture the world as it actually was at the height of the Ice Age. So much of the planet's water was frozen into glaciers that sea levels dropped over 100 meters. And where the Bering Strait sits today, there was no strait at all, just Beringia, a sprawling plain of grass and tundra over 1,000 kilometers wide, home to mammoth, bison, wild horse. And south of that plain sat two colossal ice sheets, fused together into a single wall of solid ice, thousands of feet thick in places. For most of the Ice Age, that wall made a journey south nearly unthinkable. And the corridor through it, the one from the textbook story, didn't even open until around 13,000 years ago. Which raises an obvious problem. If the door was still sealed, how were people already leaving footprints thousands of years before it opened? The first real crack in the old story didn't appear in North America at all. It appeared in Chile, at a site called Monte Verde, 6,000 miles south of that ice wall. In the 1970s, archaeologist Tom Dillahay began excavating a creekside settlement that had been sealed under peat for thousands of years, preserving things that almost never survive. And wooden hut foundations, chewed medicinal plants, even a child's footprint pressed into clay beside a hearth. The site dated to roughly 14,500 years old, older than Clovis, and thousands of miles past where the first Americans were supposed to be. For nearly 20 years, the archaeological establishment pushed back hard. It took a formal site visit by skeptical colleagues in 1997 before the field finally accepted what the evidence had been saying all along. People were in the Americas long before that ice corridor ever existed, which leaves the same question now even harder to answer. If the only walkable route south was closed, how did anyone get past two ice sheets the size of small countries? One of the leading explanations asks you to stop looking at the land and start looking at the water. Imagine a chain of productive coastal environments running from Japan, along the Aleutian Islands, down through Alaska, all the way to California, rich with life even at the peak of the Ice Age. Not a dead, frozen edge of the world, but a living highway. Fish, shellfish, seals, seabirds, enough food to sustain a journey of thousands of miles without ever needing to cross the ice at all. Researchers call it the Kelp Highway hypothesis, the idea that the first Americans didn't march through a frozen interior. They paddled, hugging the coastline in small boats, moving south along productive coastal ecosystems that could have supported travel and foraging the entire way, and while the continent behind them remained locked under ice. There's no fossilized fleet to point to. Wood and hide don't survive 10,000 years. But the physical trail is starting to surface anyway. On California's Channel Islands, archaeologists found the remains of a woman now known as Arlington Springs Woman, dated to roughly 13,000 years old, on an island that even at the lowest Ice Age sea levels could only have been reached one way, by boat. And then genetics entered the story, and the picture got stranger still. When researchers began sequencing ancient DNA from Siberia and the Americas, they expected a clean line connecting one population to the other. And what they found instead was a gap. The population that gave rise to the ancestors of indigenous peoples across the Americas appears to have split off from other Siberian groups, and then vanished from the genetic record for thousands of years before resurfacing on the American side at all. Researchers call this the Beringian standstill. The idea that a founding population lived in relative isolation, likely somewhere on Beringia itself, for a stretch some estimates place at several thousand years. Cut off from Asia by geography, cut off from the Americas by ice. Sit with that for a second. An entire founding population, waiting, generation after generation, on a strip of land that doesn't exist anymore, for a door that hadn't opened yet. And behind every one of these numbers were real people. Families navigating unfamiliar coastlines in small boats, watching the weather, rationing food, burying their dead, is raising children who would never see the homeland their grandparents remembered. Every population that eventually spread from Alaska down to the southern tip of South America descended from a relatively small number of these founding travelers, meaning the staggering diversity of two entire continents, from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, traces back to people who solved the same impossible problem. How do you cross a world still half frozen, carrying only what fits in a boat? None of this erases Clovis. It just moves it from the beginning of the story to one chapter in the middle of it. Those mammoth hunters were real, skilled, and important. They simply weren't first. And this is where the evidence and the legend finally part ways. The old story, one migration, one corridor, an empty continent waiting to be discovered, was tidy, teachable, and largely wrong. Not because anyone lied, because for decades, it was the best explanation the available evidence allowed. Beats, science rarely fails through deception. It fails through incompleteness and gets corrected, slowly, by people willing to keep digging even when the ground disagrees with the textbook. Which brings us back to those footprints in New Mexico. They don't just move a date on a chart. They suggest that for thousands of years, coastal travelers were quietly moving through a world most of us assumed stayed empty until the ice finally retreated. A migration that left almost no trace, because boats rot, coastlines drown, and campsites disappear beneath rising seas. We are very likely missing most of this story. Not because it didn't happen, because the ocean swallowed the evidence, and that's the part of this that's hard to shake. History isn't only written by whoever arrived first, it's written by whatever happens to survive. Somewhere off the coast of Alaska, beneath the Pacific, the remains of the very first American settlements may still be sitting in the dark. Camps, hearths, footprints just like the ones in New Mexico, waiting for someone to finally think to look.